Thank you. I want to thank Wested and George Mason University for inviting me to join this esteemed panel. And it's a real pleasure, and it's great to see so many people here. The title of my presentation is The School to Prison Pipeline and what research says about contributing factors and the remedies. So I'm sort of at a transition point. So I'll be describing some of the problems, but also information from our new book called Closing the School Discipline Gap, and it's available at Teachers College Press and Amazon.com. And it is a compilation of some of the leading scholars around the country who've really looked at the connections between school discipline, not only safety, but also achievement, dropout rates, predictive values for student outcomes, but also looking at what works, what should schools be doing instead of, for example, suspending students from school. And the next slide, I think, really gets to the point that many of you may not be aware of the frequency with which we suspend students out of school. Now, the data that are presented here, these are just out-of-school suspensions, so they're not even including in-school suspensions, and these don't include expulsions, and I'll speak about that in a second. But one of the things that you see, you won't see on OCR's website, maybe next time they put out the data, but we've divided the data that the federal government collects by elementary schools and secondary schools, and further disaggregated the data by race, English learner status, students with disabilities, and we have a new report coming out next week where you'll be able to get this data and graphs like this on every school district in the nation, including, for most school districts, the trends since 09-10. These data are from 09-10. The data from 11-12, which we'll be coming out with, don't look very different on the national level. But one of the things that should jump out at you is that there's a huge difference in terms of what's happening at the elementary school level and what's happening at the secondary, which is middle schools and high schools, and these are public schools. One thing that's most notable is that nearly 1 in every 4 black students in the middle school and high schools was suspended at least once in that 1 year. So these are tracking students, not numbers of suspensions. You know, this adds up to approximately, all told, about 18 million days of lost instruction every year. But another thing I want to point out is look at students with disabilities. In elementary school, about 4.1% of students with disabilities are suspended at least once. It goes to 1 in every 5, almost 20% of students with disabilities suspended at least once in that 1 year at the middle school and the high school level. And one of the things that this points out is that students with disabilities are supposed to be educated and their behavioral needs addressed by law. You cannot exclude a student with disabilities on behavioral grounds if the behavior is a manifestation of their disability. So what this suggests, when we see across every racial group, students with disabilities are suspended about twice the rate of their non-disabled peers. So this is a tremendous disparity, and it really suggests that schools are not meeting the needs, the special ed needs of the students. But what jumps out the most is the category of emotional disturbance, where 1 in 3, this is K through 12 now, 1 in 3 students with emotional disturbance suspended out of school in 2009-10, and the same number pretty much in 11-12. So this is the one category among students with disabilities which directly implicates behavior. Yet, and schools are supposed to provide behavioral assessments and improvement plans. There should be adequate counseling, special education services. One of the things that most people don't realize is that until recently, we've been tracking only long-term suspensions for kids with disabilities, including those with emotional health needs. And these data reflect suspensions of 1 day or more in a given school year. So there's a common misperception as well. So the data that I showed you don't include the kind of offenses that students are suspended for. This is something we're urging as a matter of policy, that the Department of Ed and Congress as well start collecting data not just on the number of students, but also on the offense categories. I know in the Safe and Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, you get truancy and you get some of the most serious offenses, but they don't cover all the offenses. And so oftentimes it gives you a skewed picture where people who just see that data think, oh, most of these kids are being suspended for, hitting teachers, assaults, serious felonies, when in fact, when you see the state-by-state data where they do report this, most of the offenses are for very minor and very subjective categories, things like disruption, willful defiance, disturbing an assembly, repeated truancy, repeated tardiness, and then truancy. Now, where's the deterrent value in suspending a truant student? There is none. And fortunately, the Departments of Justice and Education have issued notice to all the public schools in the nation that they should start looking at their data disaggregated by race and disability status and start addressing these disparities and thinking, is this educational policy where you're kicking a student out of school, no guarantee of adult supervision, there's really no adult intervention whatsoever that's assured when you suspend a student out of school. The other thing that, not in this slide, is that we also see the largest racial disparities in these minor subjective offenses. The frequency also, there's this myth that we have to kick the bad kids out so the good kids can learn. So there's been extensive research on this point. Russ Skiba looked at a statewide study in Indiana, and they controlled for race and poverty, and they found that the high suspending schools, when you control for those factors, actually had lower achievement. And the lower suspending schools had higher achievement. Of course, when you think about the days of lost instruction, it makes sense. When you think about the low suspending schools are probably engaging students more effectively, it makes sense that they're also probably higher performing. So these things actually go together. It's a myth that we have to kick out the bad kids so the good kids can learn. The racial disparities are also predicted. So this is a follow-up study that Dr. Skiba did, and these are everything that I'm talking about is in the book. And he found that it was the attitudes of the principals that predicted not only whether school was high suspending or low suspending, but whether there were large or small racial disparities. The other thing that we'll be coming out with, and in our prior report based on the 09-10 data also showed this, was that there's a tremendous range in the numbers of schools and districts that are either high suspending or low suspending. And what we're finding, and we did a more sort of in-depth analysis of the data, because in 11-12 we had data from every single school district. And in fact, high suspending schools are not the norm. So there are a lot of them, but there are more, and for every racial group, there are actually more low suspending elementary schools and low suspending middle schools. In our last report, we looked at Los Angeles, for example. They had the highest, just on secondary level, they had the highest number of high suspending schools and the highest number of low suspending schools right in the same district. So this is not an academic theory that there are things that are more effective. There are principals and schools working with kids in effective ways to address behavior that doesn't involve excluding them from school all across the country. In fact, they are the majority, not the minority. The other thing is that this whole idea that we're going to kick out kids to improve safety makes no sense. So some of the reasons, for example, we see a high number of kids getting kicked out for dress codes. It makes no sense because dress codes are often there because we want to prevent gang involvement. So the leading contributor to having kids involved in gangs is having them be disenfranchised from the school environment, have them be out of school during school hours. So why would you kick out a student for violating the dress code? There are lots of alternatives to leaving that student out of school unsupervised during school hours. And I noticed Miriam Rollin from formerly Fight Crime, Invest in Kids, now it's America Council for, Council for a Strong America. And they represent police officers and from around the country, and they've been a leading proponent saying we have to push back on schools. There's a lot more that schools can do to keep kids in school. There's a lot more we can do by way of adult intervention that's effective. And when we don't do that, there's more crime in the community. And if we're concerned with safety, we don't really care if a kid is bullied or shot or hurt, whether they're in school or out of school. We care about safety for everyone in the whole community. So it's really important that we think holistically about this. Okay, so another thing that we know from our research, and that even being suspended once, so a lot of people think, well, it's only the really rotten apples that are repeatedly suspended. No. So Bob BALFANZ tracked every high school student, every ninth grader in the state of Florida for over 6 years, and he found that being suspended just once in ninth grade predicted a dropout rate increase. It's correlation, not causation, but from 16% to 32%. So there were other other factors that contributed, but when he controlled for those factors, it did increase, by, I think, between 5 and 7 percentage points, the dropout rate. So this also contributes to the likelihood that students will wind up committing crime, but also involved in the juvenile justice system. Is very expensive. There are other things like chronic absenteeism and low achievement. These are all connected. So it's a mistake to think we just look at school discipline, but we have to think about school discipline not just as a safety issue, but as part of our academic analysis. How we evaluate school climate is not just about safety, it's about academic outcomes, things like graduation rates and test scores. We also have in the book a study, I'll try to go really quickly, about how those districts that invested heavily in metal detectors and school police, it's actually counterproductive. So I'm going to skip this one because it's similar to the one I just mentioned. But let's see. So Finn and Searles looked at schools after controlling, again, for race and poverty, and found that the surveys of the sense of safety, that it didn't improve safety to add metal detectors and other kinds of security measures. It was counterproductive, and it also increased suspension rates, but especially for black students. I do want to go, and David Osher from AIR did a study. After school shooting in Cleveland, they invested in more police and metal detectors. And safety ratings did not improve. But when they invested in social-emotional learning and alternatives to suspension and training of teachers, that did improve safety ratings and also improved achievement and lowered suspension rates and lowered the racial disparities. So Dewey Cornell looked at the study across Virginia and found that we don't really need to be kicking out kids, most of these kids who do exhibit threatening behavior, we don't need to be suspending them out of school. There's a whole, adopted from the juvenile justice system, of a threat assessment protocol to help administrators and teachers identify and distinguish between kids who really are threatening and those who are not. And there are other interventions. And even for kids who are threatening, there's probably more that we should be doing for them and more adult intervention than just suspending them out of school. I do want to go back to this one study of Chicago, which is really important, because overarching these studies that are in the book, one of the most important things is about school engagement. And so in this, let's see, where is it? The study that was done on Chicago schools found that the schools that ranked highest on safety ratings, both from teachers and students, where they were looking at schools serving kids from the highest crime neighborhoods, were ones where there was the highest level of teacher-student engagement and teacher-parent engagement. And guess what? These schools also had the lower suspension rates. So these things go hand in hand, and many of these schools had safety ratings that were equivalent to schools that were serving kids from the lowest crime neighborhoods in Chicago. I'm going to skip the economic piece because I think I'm almost out of time. I want to just point out, the book is filled with what works, and one of the most, I think, robust studies studied what was going on in Denver public schools for over 6 years. And there they invested in restorative practices, and I'll give you the really brief version of restorative practices. It includes holding the students accountable but keeping them in the community. It's designed to also prevent further reoccurrence because you're investing not only in having the student make some retribution or make the victim whole, but also in trying to understand the root cause of the misbehavior and the community embracing that child and trying to support that child and help them be successful and bring them back into the community. So it's rather than kicking them out of school, it involves a lot more adult intervention and community intervention, but it was proven effective. So in the 6-year period where Chicago adopted restorative practices systemically, they not only reduced the racial divide, they dramatically reduced suspensions, the most for black students, but for all kids. And during that 6-year period, their achievement scores went up for every racial group in every subject every year. So it's very powerful what works when we really invest in other alternatives to just kicking kids out of school. It's really important, here we are in Congress, to talk about some of the federal policy recommendations, and this is my last point. One of them is that we need data. So every other year, the Office for Civil Rights, the U.S. Department of Education, collects the kind of data that I've been talking about every other year. But we know that discipline is one of the leading predictors of whether kids are dropping out and other kinds of life outcomes. So we need this data every year from every school. Every district should be required to report this disaggregated by race and disability status, by gender, and enable us to see what's going on because it is such an important indicator of school climate. So this is a policy change that members of Congress who are reauthorizing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act can do today. But it's also something that the U.S. Department of Education can do now without, they have congressional authority to do this already through the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and the same authority that allows OCR to collect the data every other year allows them to collect it every year if they should make this a priority. The other thing is, it's not just the data, doing better data collection and reporting is not going to solve the problem. We have to use the data more effectively and use it to analyze what's working, our restorative practices, is it PBIS, what is working, and then the federal government has a role in supporting those programs that work and then discontinuing things that don't work. And lastly, when we look at accountability measures, whether it's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act or whether we're looking at Race to the Top and thinking about granting waivers, we should make sure that we're looking at school climate and including discipline data as part of not just a safety analysis, but on the health of our schools and whether, and side by side with academic outcomes, because it really is such an important component. So I'll end there, and thank you very much.